The night they locked me out, the snow fell in thick, silent waves that covered everything I had ever called home. It was January in Burlington, Vermont, 2 in the morning, and the world was white and quiet, except for the wind tearing through my coat. I stood barefoot on the wooden porch with my swollen belly pressing hard against the fabric of my thin pajamas. 6 months pregnant and shaking, I stared at the light inside the house where my father and stepmother stood. The porch light flickered above me, turning the falling snow into shards of silver. My breath came out in white clouds that disappeared into the night. Inside the window, I saw their shadows moving. I banged on the door with the side of my fist. My voice cracked. "Dad, please, it's freezing." Vivian's voice cut through the wind. Cold, sharp, final. "You are not part of this family anymore, Rowan." The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was louder than the wind. I felt something in me collapse. My fingers went numb first, then my legs. The snow kept building on my hair and eyelashes. It was the kind of cold that makes everything quiet in your head, like the world is shrinking down to one thin thread of pain. I pressed my palms against the door, but it didn't give. I could hear their footsteps moving away. The yellow light from the living room cast my shadow long and thin across the snow. I tried the handle again, even though I already knew. Locked. It wasn't the storm that scared me most. It was the sound of their laughter fading down the hallway. A sharp pain rippled through my lower stomach. At first, I thought it was just the cold, but then the second wave hit harder. I gasped, bending forward, feeling the air leave my lungs. My bare feet were burning and freezing at the same time. The snow was biting into my skin. I screamed their names again. "Arthur! Vivian! Please!" No answer. Only the wind howling across the open fields behind the house. The porch light blinked again. I turned toward the darkness beyond the yard, wondering if I should walk. But there was nowhere to go. The storm had swallowed the road. My phone was inside. The baby kicked weakly against my ribs. The pain came in pulses now, each one sharper than the last. My knees buckled. I fell onto the steps, snow covering the thin cotton of my clothes. The wooden railing was cold enough to burn. I clung to it, breathing hard, my teeth chattering so loud I could barely hear myself whisper, "It's okay, baby. Just hold on." The moment stretched long and brutal. I thought of the night my mother died, how my father had once held me so tight I couldn't breathe. That man didn't exist anymore. The person behind that door had chosen Vivian over me, over his grandchild. The snow crawled up my calves like water filling a glass. I tried standing again, but my legs wouldn't listen. My breath grew shallow. The world started blurring at the edges. I don't remember collapsing. I only remember the sound. Sirens slicing through the storm like a knife. Someone must have called. A light flashed across the yard. Red and blue bled into the white night. The wind rushed over my ears, and then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes again, the light above me was no longer yellow. It was white, harsh, clinical. I could smell antiseptic and the faint trace of snow melting off my skin. A nurse was talking softly near the door. The monitor beside me beeped in slow rhythm. A doctor stepped forward. His voice was gentle, too gentle, and I knew before he spoke that everything had changed. "Rowan, I'm so sorry. We couldn't save the baby." My hands went to my stomach before I even thought. It was flat, empty, cold. The ceiling blurred. My breath caught somewhere deep inside me and never came out. I didn't cry. I just stared at the tiles above me while the wind outside pounded against the hospital windows like a memory that wouldn't leave. My baby was gone. In that moment, something inside me cracked in a way that would never fully heal. They had left me outside to freeze. My father, my stepmother, the people who were supposed to protect me. I had begged them and they turned away. I lay there in that hospital bed with nothing but the sound of machines and the weight of a silence so loud it felt alive. I made a promise to myself that night. They would never get to pretend nothing happened. They would never get to walk through their perfect house smile at their perfect friends and act like I didn't nearly die on that porch. I was done begging. I was done freezing outside the door. If you have ever been betrayed by your own family, you know this kind of silence. It's the moment when the world stops spinning and your soul goes still. The moment when you stop waiting to be saved and decide to fight. So I'll ask you this. If the people who raised you were the ones who left you in the cold, what would you do? I grew up in a house that smelled like pine and varnish. It was the kind of house that tourists admired when they passed through Vermont, all carved wood and high beams, a place that was supposed to be filled with warmth. For years, I believed it was. My father, Arthur Blake, ran a timber company with the precision of a man who built his identity from the ground up. He was strict but proud, and when I was a little girl, I thought the sun rose and set on him. My mother died when I was 9, and after the funeral, the house felt like it had lost its heartbeat. For years, it was just me and him, two quiet people moving through a house too big for our grief. Then, when I turned 15, Vivian walked in. She was polished in a way that didn't belong to Vermont. She wore silk scarves and red lipstick to Sunday breakfast. She had the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. I knew from the start she was never going to be my mother, but my father looked at her like she was the answer to a question I never asked. That was the first fracture. It didn't shatter all at once. It spread quietly like a hairline crack in glass. At first, it was small things. She corrected the way I sat at the dinner table. She told my father I should attend etiquette classes. She bought new furniture that erased every trace of my mother's taste. The house I grew up in slowly stopped looking like home. My father didn't notice, or maybe he did and pretended not to. Years later, when I left for college in Boston, Vivian was the one who signed the checks. She controlled the money. She also decided when the checks stopped coming. It wasn't gradual. One day, my tuition was covered, the next, she sent me an email that said, "You're an adult now. You should learn how to stand on your own 2 feet." She copied my father in that email. He never replied. I worked double shifts for 2 semesters just to keep up with rent. My father visited Boston once. He didn't stay long. He said Vivian needed him back home. I told myself it was fine. I told myself families change. But it wasn't fine. It was the slow disassembly of everything I had once trusted. I think part of me still believed there would be a turning point, a day when my father would look at me and remember who I was before Vivian rewrote the script of our lives. That day never came. Instead, the distance grew until it wasn't just physical. It was silence. Cold, deliberate silence. When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't expect them to celebrate, but I thought they would at least care. I had rehearsed the conversation in my head. I would tell them, gently explain that it wasn't a mistake that I wanted this child, that I could build a life. I wanted my father to hear the strength in my voice. Instead, what I got was Vivian's laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was a sharp, brittle sound that cracked across the phone. She said I had shamed the family. My father didn't contradict her. He said nothing. He didn't even ask if I was okay. In that silence, I understood how small I had become in his world. A week later, I drove up to Burlington, my heart pounding, hoping face-to-face would be different. He stood at the front door in his heavy wool coat, his hands in his pockets. I told him about the baby. I told him I needed support, not money, just his presence. He looked at me like he was staring at a stranger. Vivian came down the stairs behind him, wrapped in a cream-colored sweater that matched the snow outside. She leaned against the railing with that satisfied tilt of her head. She said the house didn't have space for another mouth to feed. She said the family name didn't need this kind of stain. My father didn't stop her. He said with the same voice he once used to tell me bedtime stories, "The house isn't your place anymore." That moment wasn't a lightning strike. It was the final thread snapping after years of erosion. I remember gripping the steering wheel of my car in their driveway, snow beginning to fall again, my knuckles white. The house behind me looked exactly the same as when I was a child, but it wasn't my home anymore. I should have known then what was coming. I should have realized that the people who turn their backs on you when you need them the most are capable of far worse. Even in those days before the storm, the part of me that refused to die was taking notes. I started to remember every word, every moment she cut me out, and he let her. I started to imagine what it would be like to stand in front of both of them one day and make them watch everything they had built crumble the way they crumbled me. That thought was quiet then, just a whisper buried under the hurt. But whispers have a way of growing. Back then, I didn't know how to fight. I didn't have lawyers or evidence or a plan. Ew. I only had this gnawing pain inside me and the fading echo of a father who no longer saw me. But something hardened in me that day. Vivian thought she was erasing me from the family she had taken over. What she didn't realize was that people who are erased learn how to carve their names back into the world, not with kindness, but with precision. That night in their driveway, with the snow falling on my windshield, I promised myself if they ever pushed me past the edge, I would not fall quietly. I would make the world watch. Looking back now, it's clear. The night they locked me out wasn't an accident. It was the end of a long story they had been writing without me. But they forgot something important. They forgot I was still listening. They forgot what happens when the girl they tried to bury decides to come back. In the weeks before the storm, the air around the house changed. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was quiet and sharp like glass under bare feet. I kept trying to call my father, hoping to hear his voice without Vivian in the background, but every time the line clicked, it was her who answered. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. She just said things that made the silence heavier. Your father is busy. Your father doesn't want to talk to you right now. He agrees with me. Then the line would go dead and I would be left holding the phone, listening to nothing. When he finally picked up, once his voice didn't sound like the man who used to tuck me in at night, it was flat and distant. Rowan, you need to listen to Vivian. That's all he said. Not how are you, not how's the baby. Just listen to Vivian. That sentence played on a loop in my head like a warning I tried to ignore. I started driving by the house more often, parking just far enough down the road so they wouldn't see me. I told myself it was just to feel close to him, but the truth is, I was already looking for cracks. Once through the kitchen window, I saw him and Vivian standing at the counter. She was laughing at something, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and he was nodding like a man who had forgotten he ever had a daughter. I waited for him to look out the window to glance at the street like he always used to when I came home late from school. He never did. I felt like a ghost. The neighbors noticed things before I let myself admit them. Mrs. Hendricks, who lived 2 houses down, stopped me at the grocery store. She asked if I was okay. I lied and told her I was fine. She hesitated like she wanted to say more. Later, I overheard her whispering to someone at the bakery. Something about Vivian saying terrible things about me, that I had ruined my life, that I was unstable, that my father couldn't bear to see me. She said it loud enough for people to hear, loud enough to make sure it stuck. When I confronted my father, he didn't deny it. He just said Vivian is just worried about how you make the family look. The family. That word burned more than anything else. I had stopped being a person to him. I was a problem to manage. I told myself that if I just stayed quiet, if I just kept my head down, he would remember. People do that when they love you, right? They remember. But every time I stepped into that house, the air got colder. Vivian made sure I never felt like I belonged. She rearranged the furniture so nothing was where it used to be. She replaced the family photos on the mantel with pictures of herself and my father at charity galas, looking like the perfect couple. The only photo left of my mother was in my room upstairs, and even that felt like a countdown. One afternoon I came home and found it gone. She didn't bother to hide what she had done. She said, "It's time to move forward, Rowan." I heard my father in the next room. He didn't say a word. The signs were everywhere. The way he stopped making eye contact. The way she would finish his sentences. The way she moved around the house like a queen in her palace and he followed like a shadow. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was an intruder who happened to share blood. The neighbors saw it too. Once at a neighborhood dinner, Vivian made a joke about how some people never grow up. Everyone laughed except me. My father sipped his drink and stared at the table. I felt the humiliation crawl over my skin like frost. But I didn't fight back. That's the thing about family. You let them cut deeper than anyone else because you keep hoping they'll stop. The last signal should have been the clearest, but I still ignored it. The night before the storm, the house was wrapped in that heavy silence that always came when Vivian was waiting to strike. She told me to go outside and get some air. Her voice was calm, the kind of calm that sounds reasonable until you realize it isn't. She said it like a suggestion, like something a kind person might say. I remember standing at the threshold with the wind already biting at my face. She smiled. that soft, empty smile that never reached her eyes. "Go on, Rowan," she said. "It'll clear your head." I stepped out onto the porch, and before I could turn back, I heard it. The click, that cold, deliberate sound of a lock turning. My hand froze on the door handle. For a second, I thought it was a mistake, but I saw the curtain shift in the living room window. I saw the shadow of her face the way she lingered just long enough for me to know it wasn't an accident. It wasn't heat of the moment. It was deliberate. It was the first time I truly understood that Vivian wasn't just cruel. She was methodical. She was building a story in which I was the problem and she was the savior. My father would follow her like he always did. That moment should have lit the fire in me right away, but I went back the next day like a fool. I knocked until my knuckles ached. She opened the door, still smiling, and said, "Oh, you're back." Her voice dripped with sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. My father stood behind her with his hands in his pockets, not meeting my gaze. That's when I felt it settle into my bones. This wasn't just tension. It wasn't misunderstanding. This was war, and I was the only one who hadn't accepted it yet. Looking back, that was the night the warning bells went off. The way she locked me out just for a few minutes. The way he stood behind her and said nothing. It was the first rehearsal for what they would do later. They tested how far they could push me. They saw I didn't push back. That silence was my biggest mistake. They saw it, they learned it, and they used it. When the storm finally came, they didn't have to think twice. They already knew how the story would end. The night of the storm lives in my body like a scar carved too deep to fade. The wind was already howling when I stepped out onto the porch, carrying that strange stillness that comes before something breaks. Snow was falling so fast it blurred the edges of everything, swallowing the road, the trees, the house across the field. The porch light buzzed weakly above me, throwing a pale yellow halo onto the white world. I turned back to the door. It was shut. At first, I thought maybe it had closed on its own, but then I saw it. Through the thin slit of the curtain, a shadow moved. Vivian. She didn't step away like she hadn't seen me. She stood there watching. I raised my hand and knocked. My knuckles were stiff from the cold, but I hit the wood anyway. "Dad, it's freezing." "Let me in." The wind carried my voice away. Inside, nothing moved. I knocked again, harder this time, my pulse rising in my throat. The only thing I could hear was the storm wrapping its arms around the house. Then it came the sound I will never forget, the clean, metallic slide of the deadbolt locking into place. My breath caught. I leaned closer, pressing my palm against the door. "Vivian, please." The porch light flickered, and for a second I thought she would open it. But through the glass, I saw her face pale and calm, framed by that curtain. She tilted her head slightly like someone observing a stranger on the street. Then, she walked away. My chest tightened, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, heavier. I grabbed the handle. It didn't move. I banged on the door again. "Dad, please, it's me." Nothing. The snow had already started piling around my ankles. It was the kind of cold that crawls up your bones, deliberate and merciless. I stepped back, trying to see through the window, but the living room light was too bright and the glass too fogged. All I could make out were the warm yellow shapes of the life they chose without me. My father somewhere inside, not moving, not coming. A gust of wind shoved snow against the porch steps, and the flakes stung when they hit my skin. I wrapped my arms around my belly. The baby kicked weakly, just a small flutter under my ribs, but it felt like a scream. I whispered to my stomach, trying to steady my breath. "It's okay. We'll be okay." I reached for my phone in my pocket, but my hand closed around nothing. I'd left it inside. Of course I had. I tried to focus on something, anything, but the cold was sinking its teeth in. I forced my legs to move toward the window again, praying my father would appear, but he didn't. I could see only her silhouette crossing the hallway. Calm, unhurried. She pulled the curtain closed. The pain started low like a cramp, sharp and fast. I doubled over, clutching my stomach. The sound that came out of me wasn't even a scream. It was the small, broken sound of someone who realizes no one is coming. I pressed both hands against the door. My breath fogged the glass. My skin burned. I slammed my palm against the wood again. "Arthur! Vivian! Please!" The only response was the wind ripping through the fields and the storm growing louder. I turned toward the yard. The snow blurred the driveway. No lights, no cars. The world beyond the house didn't exist anymore. I pressed the 911 code into the keypad by the door, praying the signal would work, but the line never connected. The storm had cut it. I laughed a small, breathless sound because it almost felt like a sick joke. Then another pain tore through me sharper than before. My knees buckled. I fell onto the porch, my hands scraping against the icy wood. The snow soaked through my thin clothes, clinging to my skin like ice claws. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't listen. The porch light flickered again, and I thought I saw movement behind the curtain. Vivian's face watching. For a heartbeat, I thought she might open the door, but she didn't. She just turned away. That small, deliberate motion snapped something inside me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a family fight. This was a choice. She was choosing to let me freeze. My father was choosing silence. The next pain was brutal, pulling everything tight inside me. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. I leaned back against the door and whispered to the baby again, not even sure what I was saying anymore. My teeth chattered so hard I could barely form words. I pressed my forehead against the wood. It was so warm compared to the air outside. Just inches away from warmth, from life, from everything I had ever trusted. The world narrowed. The snow climbed my calves. My hands shook uncontrollably. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, fast and shallow. Somewhere in the distance, a siren cut through the storm. I don't know if it was real or if my mind was trying to build a way out, but the sound grew closer. Red and blue lights bled through the curtain of snow. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the paramedics pulling me off the porch. Someone said, "She's freezing. She's pregnant." I wanted to tell them about the door, about the lock, about my father standing somewhere behind the light, but the words never came. My lips were too cold to move. When I woke up, the light above me was harsh and white. The sound of the machines was steady like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. A nurse was speaking softly, moving around me. My clothes had been cut away. A blanket weighed on me like a fragile shield. My hands went to my stomach. Flat, empty, cold. The doctor walked in with that look people wear when they don't want to say the words. "Rowan, I'm so sorry. We couldn't save the baby." I stared at the ceiling tiles as if the answer was written somewhere up there. I didn't cry. The tears never came. I just listened to the steady beep of the monitor while the storm outside raged against the hospital windows like it was trying to get in. Arthur and Vivian never showed up. They left me out there and they didn't even come to the hospital. The kind of wound that leaves no visible scar is the one that kills slowly. It wasn't just the baby I lost that night. It was the last piece of who I thought my family was. If you've ever been betrayed like that, you know what I mean. There are wounds that bleed and heal, and then there are wounds like this. The ones no one sees, the ones that rot in the dark. Those are the ones that change everything. Those are the ones that make you stop waiting for love and start preparing for war. The hospital room was so still it felt like the world outside had frozen along with me. I signed the papers without really reading them. Death certificate, fetal demise. All those cold clinical words that strip everything human out of something that once felt like the center of your life. My hand didn't shake. My eyes didn't water. I had no tears left. It felt like the storm outside had carved everything out of me and left only silence. The nurse tried to speak softly, offering me a blanket, a cup of water, something warm, but it was like her words hit a wall before they could reach me. They told me I could stay overnight, and I nodded because I didn't have anywhere else to go. The doctor left. The nurse left. I was alone with the machines and the smell of antiseptic. It's strange how quiet a room can be when the loudest thing in your life has just been ripped away. I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the lines like they might spell out an answer, but there was nothing, just the hollow kind of silence that digs under your skin. I used to think grief came in waves, but that night it was a single punch to the chest that didn't stop hurting. I pressed my hand against my stomach and felt nothing. No movement, no heartbeat, just skin and cold. Aiden Cole showed up when the sun was barely rising, his shoes tracking snow through the hallway. He was one of those friends you don't talk to for years, but still know exactly where to find you when everything falls apart. He didn't say the usual words. He didn't say sorry or it'll be okay. He looked at me the way someone looks at a burned-out house. He walked closer, sat down beside the bed, and spoke low. "Rowan, they didn't just take your baby. They tried to take you." The words landed hard, not soft like comfort, but sharp like truth. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You can't let them erase you." I stared at him for a long time. My throat was tight. My mind was a blur of cold and broken promises. But somewhere beneath the numbness, something shifted. I started replaying everything. The lock clicking. Vivian's face behind the curtain. My father's silence. It wasn't a single night. It was every moment that had led here. Aiden kept talking, but I wasn't really hearing words. I was hearing echoes. All the times I begged for attention, all the times I told myself family meant forgiveness. The truth was burning now. They hadn't just turned their backs on me. They had planned it. Quietly. Cruelly. Aiden put a file folder on the table beside my bed. Legal paper. Not flowers. Not sympathy cards. Paper. "You need to protect yourself. You need to think smart. This isn't just about pain anymore. It's about power." He had always been like that, the boy who became a lawyer with a mind sharp as a blade. He didn't flinch at ugliness. He used it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. But I felt my heartbeat changing. It was no longer weak and drifting. It was steady, cold. I forced myself to sit up later that day. The nurse tried to help me, but I waved her off. Standing hurt. Everything inside hurt. But I walked to the bathroom anyway. The mirror was harsh under the fluorescent light. My stomach was flat now, my skin pale, my hair sticking to my face. I didn't recognize the woman looking back, but her eyes were different. There was no pleading in them anymore. No softness left for people who locked her in the snow. Just the quiet, heavy kind of rage that doesn't burn out. I whispered to the mirror without even planning to. "They'll never get away with this." When I stepped back into the room, Aiden was on the phone. His voice was low but precise, already moving pieces I hadn't thought to touch. He ended the call and looked at me like he had known this version of me was coming. "There are cameras, Rowan. Mrs. Hendricks has one pointing toward the porch. It probably caught everything. Vivian locking the door. You outside. That's not just cruelty. That's negligence. That's evidence." My mind snapped into a different place. It wasn't warm. It was made of edges. Every detail of that night came flooding back, not like memories, but like puzzle pieces falling into place. I started listing everything out loud, the exact moment the lock clicked. Lock. The neighbors who saw me leave. The storm warnings on the news. The missed calls I made earlier that night. The way Vivian stared at me through the curtain. The way my father didn't even turn on the porch light for help. Aiden scribbled notes on a pad like a soldier marking coordinates. Then he looked up. "We can build this. If they thought they could bury this, they're wrong." I sank back onto the bed, but I didn't feel small anymore. The grief didn't shrink. It just changed shape. It became a weapon I could hold. They expected me to disappear quietly. That's what people like them always expect. The weak daughter, the outcast, the girl who takes the blame and fades into silence. They had no idea what they created the moment they left me outside that door. Later that evening, Aiden came back with printouts from public records and a contact for a private investigator. His speed scared me a little, but it also anchored me. He explained how this could work. If the footage existed, we could secure it legally. If the texts between me and my father showed what they said, we could use it. If we could prove intent, we could drag everything they had built into the light. And he wasn't talking only about criminal charges. He was talking about their reputation, their business, their perfect image. He wasn't gentle, and I didn't need him to be. When he left, the nurse came to check on me. She asked if I needed anything. I said no. But after she walked out, I sat on the bed and opened my notebook, the one I used to keep for lists and baby names. I turned to a blank page and wrote the word evidence at the top. Then I started writing everything I could remember every second of that night, every slight that led to it. I didn't cry while writing. I didn't shake. The pen moved fast, like it had been waiting for this. By the time darkness fell outside the hospital window again, I had filled 5 pages. It wasn't enough to undo what they did. It wasn't enough to bring back what I lost, but it was the beginning of something they wouldn't see coming. Aiden once told me the most dangerous people are the ones who have nothing left to lose. I understood that now. They took everything that made me soft. All that was left was what they built themselves, a blade. Before I fell asleep that night, I whispered into the quiet, I'm going to make sure they never forget. Not the porch, not the snow, not the sound of their own lock sealing me out. They wanted to erase me. They created something they can't control. The next morning, I walked to the mirror again. My reflection hadn't changed. Same face, same scars in my eyes. But this time, I didn't see the girl begging for love. I saw the woman who would make them regret underestimating her. I touched the glass. Cold met cold. And for the first time since that night, I felt something solid beneath my feet. I knew exactly where this was going. I knew exactly how it would end. The first thing I learned about revenge is that it doesn't start with rage. Rage is loud, messy, uncontrollable. Real revenge starts in silence. In hospitals, in parking lots, in late-night conversations whispered over burner phones. Aiden knew that better than anyone. 2 weeks after I left the hospital, we sat in his office, the air thick with the smell of old books and winter air sneaking through the cracked window. I wore black gloves because my hands wouldn't stop shaking from the cold, but my voice didn't shake when I told him I wanted every detail. He nodded like he had been waiting for me to say that. Then he slid a small card across the desk. A private investigator. Discreet. Efficient. No questions asked. I met the investigator 2 days later in a diner on the edge of town. His name was Harris. Gray hair, sharp eyes, the kind of man who didn't waste words. He had already pulled the local street camera archives, but the gold mine wasn't the city. It was the neighbors, Ms. Hendricks had a camera facing her driveway. Harris had a copy of the footage before I even finished my coffee. He slid the USB across the table. You might not want to watch it alone, he said. But I did. I went back to my apartment, locked the door, and opened my laptop. The timestamp glared at me. 2:02 a.m. There I was, on the porch, snow whipping around me like a living thing, my hands pounding on the door, the light inside warm and steady. Then Vivian's silhouette appeared at the curtain. She looked directly at me, raised her hand, and with terrifying calmness turned the lock. I could see her mouth move. She laughed. I pressed pause. My heart slammed against my ribs. The next part was worse. My father's shadow appeared behind her. He didn't come forward. He didn't move. He just stood there watching while his daughter froze on the other side of the door. I replayed it twice, 3 times, until the shock burned into something harder. Harris was right. I shouldn't have watched it alone, but it wasn't because it broke me. It was because it sharpened me. Aiden was waiting when I walked into his office the next morning. I didn't say a word. I just handed him the USB. His jaw tightened when he saw the footage. He didn't need to explain the legal weight of what we had. He just said one sentence. This is enough to end them. The next few weeks blurred into strategy. Aiden brought in a litigation team from Burlington, people who didn't blink when I told them I wanted it all exposed. Not just criminal negligence, not just civil, reputation, assets, power. We met in a conference room that smelled of burnt coffee and printer toner. The lawyers asked me to recount everything from the day Vivian entered my life to the night they left me on that porch. I spoke slowly. No tears. No tremors. Just facts. When they showed me the transcript of my statement afterward, it read like a case study in betrayal. Harris dug deeper. He interviewed Mrs. Hendricks, who remembered seeing me pounding on the door that night. He tracked down another neighbor who heard me screaming my father's name through the storm. Their statements matched the footage down to the minute. We had timestamps, visual proof, and corroboration. Aiden moved like a man who'd waited years to burn something down. But I wanted more than just legal ammunition. I wanted to tear down everything they had built around their image. So one night I drove back to the house. It wasn't snowing this time, but the air was cold enough to bite. The house looked exactly the same, perfect, silent, like nothing had ever happened. Vivian's car was in the garage. My father's truck sat in the driveway. I parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the way, every step sinking into the frozen ground. The front porch still had the faint outline of where the paramedics' boots had been that night. I stood there for a full minute, breathing in the memory, letting it soak into my bones. Then I picked the lock on the back door. It wasn't hard. I had lived in that house for years. I knew its weaknesses. I slipped inside like a shadow. The hallway smelled the same. Pine varnish, Vivian's perfume. I went straight to my father's study. He kept everything locked, but he never changed the combination. 3rd drawer, bottom right. Inside were the trust documents, the property deeds, the insurance forms. Their empire was built on paper. I took pictures of everything page after page, making sure every signature, every date, every figure was sharp. I didn't touch anything else. No broken windows, no alarms, just a ghost passing through. On my way out, I stopped in the living room. The curtain she had closed on me that night hung perfectly straight, the fabric smooth and neat. I lifted it slightly, just enough to see the porch from the inside. For a second, I imagined what it must have looked like to them that night. Me on the outside, them warm and safe on the inside. I lowered the curtain without a sound. Back in Aiden's office, I laid the photos out on the table. He stared at them for a long time. These aren't just legal. These are leverage, he said. And leverage, Rowan, is what people like Vivian fear more than prison. He was right. The Blake family name meant something in Burlington. They built their lives around being untouchable. Aiden was about to touch everything. The legal team started building the narrative, a clear timeline, motive, intent. They threaded the footage, the witness statements, the financial records into a story no one could ignore. Vivian wasn't just cruel. She was calculating. My father wasn't just weak. He was complicit. They had locked me out in a storm, knowing full well what could happen, then walked away. Every night I replayed the footage in my head. But instead of crying, I studied it like a strategist studies a battlefield. Every detail became a weapon. The way Vivian tilted her head, the way my father stayed back, the way the porch light flickered when the lock clicked. They thought I was helpless. They had no idea that helplessness can ferment into precision. Harris found even more. A series of texts between Vivian and a friend bragging about finally getting me out of the house. She wrote, "She's her father's problem now, not mine." She didn't know the police could subpoena those messages. She didn't know Aiden's team was already preparing to. When Aiden read those words out loud in the conference room, the lawyers didn't look surprised. They looked hungry. I spent those weeks in motion. No more hospital beds, no more begging. I was quiet, deliberate, moving pieces on a board they didn't even know existed. While they went to their charity events and business dinners, I was building the story that would undo them. When the legal team told me they were ready to proceed, I didn't feel triumph. I felt something colder. They would never see me coming. That was the beauty of it. They still thought I was the broken girl on the porch. They still thought I would disappear. They didn't realize they had left the wrong person outside that night. The last night before we filed, I went back to the mirror. I saw the same eyes that had stared up at the hospital ceiling, empty and frozen, but now they were focused, sharp. If they had left me bleeding in the snow, I would return as a storm they couldn't contain. I whispered their names like a promise. Vivian, Arthur, you will learn what silence can build, and this time it won't be me locked outside. It will be you. 1 year after the night they left me to freeze Vermont was in full winter again. The air outside was sharp enough to cut through fabric, and the snow that morning looked too clean, too quiet. I stood across the street from the Burlington Civic Hall, watching as cars rolled up the circular driveway. Men in tailored coats and women in expensive heels moved through the glass doors under the banner of the Blake Family Winter Gala for Hope. Vivian loved that phrase. Hope. It was printed on every invitation embossed in silver. I stood perfectly still, my hands in the pockets of my black wool coat, the cold biting at my cheeks, and waited until the clock struck 7. Inside, the room glittered with chandeliers and polished marble, the kind of event that feeds off polite laughter and carefully curated reputations. I knew every detail because I used to be part of these nights standing off to the side while Vivian soaked in the attention. This time, I wasn't a ghost in the corner. I was the storm they didn't see coming. Aiden was already inside, blending in with the lawyers and sponsors. Harris handled the technical setup hours earlier, slipping the video file into the gala's presentation queue without anyone noticing. Everything was in place. I walked in through the front doors like I belonged there. Heads turned. For a heartbeat, no one recognized me. Then I saw Vivian across the room in a cream gown, her hair twisted into its usual immaculate knot, surrounded by donors and photographers. She laughed that practiced laugh that could charm any room. But when her eyes found me standing at the back, wearing a black tailored suit and no smile, the sound caught in her throat. Her face stiffened just enough for me to see the crack beneath the surface. She recovered fast, but not fast enough. The first blow had landed. Arthur was near the stage, shaking hands with an old family friend. He looked older than I remembered, but not broken. Not yet. I walked closer, my heels clicking on the marble like a metronome. He turned toward the sound. For a second, something like recognition flickered in his eyes. Then it faltered. Guilt eats people slowly. I wanted him to feel every bite. Vivian stepped forward, blocking the line between me and him. Her voice was a soft, poisoned blade. "Rowan, this isn't the time." I tilted my head slightly, mirroring the exact gesture she made behind that curtain a year ago. My voice was calm, colder than the snow outside. "It's the perfect time." She opened her mouth to respond, but the lights dimmed. "Showtime." The projector came to life with a soft mechanical click. Everyone turned their attention to the large screen behind the stage. Vivian froze. Her PR team had planned a highlight reel of charity work speeches, warm images of the perfect Blake family. What appeared instead was darkness. Then, snow. The footage started, a single porch light flickering against the storm. The audience shifted in their seats. It wasn't an image they recognized. Then the camera caught me. A pregnant woman in thin pajamas, barefoot, pounding on the door of a house glowing with warm light. Someone whispered. The image zoomed in. A shadow appeared at the curtain. Vivian's face, clear, unmistakable. She reached forward and locked the door. Then she smiled, laughed. The sound in the hall wasn't silence anymore. It was breath catching in 100 throats. Then came the second silhouette. My father, standing behind her, not moving, not helping, watching. The footage didn't lie. It didn't need commentary. It played like a nightmare recorded in perfect clarity. The version of them they'd spent years crafting cracked in front of their donors and friends. The air in the room changed. No music, no polite laughter. Just the slow rising wave of murmurs as people began to understand what they were seeing. One woman in the front row pressed her hand to her chest. A man shook his head. Someone whispered loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Is that her pregnant?" Vivian spun toward the control booth, but Aiden was already there with a quiet nod to the technician. The video kept playing. It showed me falling against the porch snow building around me. It showed the porch light blinking like a warning. It showed everything. I didn't need to say a word. The room was doing it for me. The sponsors, the friends, the old business partners, they were all turning their heads to Vivian, to Arthur, to the people who called themselves good, kind, philanthropic. Vivian's skin went pale. Arthur's shoulders began to shake as he dropped his gaze to the floor. The final frame froze on her face. That perfect cold smile as I begged outside. Then the screen went black. Aiden stepped out from the back, clearing his throat. His voice was crisp, controlled. What you've just seen is unedited footage captured from a neighbor's security camera the night of January 7th last year. For some of you, the Blakes are pillars of this community. To me and to the law, they are something else entirely. Vivian shouted over him. This is a lie! She looked desperate now, pulling at the edges of the silk gown that once made her untouchable. She turned to Arthur. Say something. But Arthur didn't. He couldn't. He just stood there, shaking his head slowly like the weight of what he'd done was finally heavy enough to crush him. The journalists who'd been invited to cover the gala for fluff pieces had their cameras raised. Flashbulbs went off like gunfire. Every angle of her pale face was captured every inch of his shame. One by one, the donors began to stand at their chairs, scraping against the floor. Not toward Vivian. Away from her. Some whispered words I couldn't hear. Others just stared at her like they'd never really seen her before. Vivian stepped toward me, then the mask completely gone. Her voice was low, sharp. You planned this. You ruined everything. I didn't flinch. I didn't have to. I just met her eyes. No, Vivian, you did. Vivian. You. Arthur took a step forward. Rowan. His voice cracked like old wood. I raised my hand, stopping him mid-step. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. There was nothing left to say. The world had already seen it. The room was alive with whispers, now the sound of reputations dissolving. Some of the people here had known my family since I was a child. Some had done business with them for decades. None of them would forget what they had just witnessed. That was the point. I didn't need to scream. I just needed them to look. I turned and walked toward the exit, leaving them under the hot light of their own destruction. Aiden fell into step behind me as the noise inside rose to a storm of its own. Before I reached the door, I looked back one last time. Vivian was standing alone near the stage, clutching the folds of her gown like it could shield her. Arthur had sunk into one of the chairs, head in his hands. The footage still burned on the retinas of everyone in that room. For a year, they walked around this town like nothing happened, like I was just a ghost who vanished into the snow. But ghosts have a way of haunting the living. That night, I gave them back everything they gave me. Cold, silence, exposure. Outside, the snow was falling again, clean, bright. I tilted my face up to it and let the cold sting my skin. For the first time in a year, I could breathe without feeling like the air itself was a cage. Behind me, their world was cracking, and I didn't need to look back to know it would never be the same again. This was the moment everything shifted. The night I stopped being the girl locked out in the storm and became the storm itself. And they were finally the ones left standing in the cold. The morning after the gala, Burlington was louder than I had ever heard it. News vans lined the streets outside the Blake estate. Reporters clustered at the gates like vultures circling something already dead. The air crackled with the cold and the weight of what everyone had seen. I didn't need to turn on the television to know that the footage from that night had already spread beyond the gala. Harris had made sure of that. Local news stations were running it on repeat. Headlines screamed betrayal cruelty scandal. The perfect Blake family had cracked open and everyone was looking inside. I stood at my apartment window, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the snow drift past the glass, while the world that used to own me burned down across town. The investigation moved fast. The footage was too clear, the timeline too precise, the legal groundwork already prepared by Aiden's team months before. 2 days after the exposure, detectives knocked on the Blake estate's heavy oak doors. The charges weren't for murder or assault, but for something that still cut deep criminal negligence causing harm. It was a quiet, cold kind of justice, the kind that doesn't need to shout. The district attorney's office took one look at the footage and opened a formal case. My father and Vivian were no longer untouchable donors. They were subjects of an active investigation. The community that once worshipped their reputation turned overnight. The same neighbors who whispered behind their hands now whispered louder on record with microphones in their faces. Mrs. Hendricks gave an interview standing in front of her fence, saying she'd always known something wasn't right that night. Another neighbor admitted he heard me screaming through the storm and never forgot the sound. What had been shame whispered in corners became the chorus that surrounded the house they had locked me out of. Within a week, the board of Blake Timber announced Arthur Blake's temporary removal pending legal review. They said the words carefully, the way companies do when they're more worried about reputation than morality, but the meaning was clear. He wasn't the respected patriarch anymore. He was liability. He walked out of that boardroom with the cameras flashing in his face, the same cameras that once celebrated his ribbon cuttings and charity speeches. He didn't look at them. He didn't look at anyone. He just kept walking, shoulders hunched under a coat that didn't make him look powerful anymore. It made him look small. Vivian's fall was faster. The foundation she built around herself, all those charity events and photo ops collapsed in days. Sponsors pulled out. Her face vanished from event posters. The board stripped her of her title as chairwoman, citing reputational damage. The irony was that the damage wasn't reputational at all. It was truth. Her perfect smile was now the image people associated with a woman laughing as someone froze outside her door. It didn't matter how many speeches she had given or how much money she had raised. That one moment caught on camera defined her. Financial investigators came next. Not for revenge, but because people like the Blakes always have layers of secrets. Once their power fractured, the cracks widened. Several of their assets were frozen pending civil suits. Lawsuits followed quickly, not just from me, but from partners who had stayed silent for years. The world doesn't like weakness. When a pillar falls, everyone rushes to collect a piece of the rubble. The press couldn't get enough of it. They called me the daughter left in the snow, the woman who turned the storm back on her parents. The headlines were cold and sharp, just like the night everything started. I didn't give interviews. I didn't make statements. Aiden handled the legal press. Harris ignored the reporters camped outside my apartment. I went to work every morning, drank coffee, and watched their empire disintegrate piece by piece. Some people think revenge is a loud explosion. For me, it was quiet, methodical, watching everything they loved turn to ash without lifting a finger. The first time I saw my father after the gala was in the hallway of the courthouse. He had aged 20 years in a week. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes were hollow. He walked past me without lifting his head, surrounded by lawyers who spoke for him because he no longer could. Vivian wasn't with him. She had moved out of the house after the board expelled her. Even they couldn't survive each other once the world knew what they had done. Outside the courthouse, reporters screamed. My name, shoving microphones toward me like weapons. Rowan, do you have a statement? Rowan, do you hate them? Rowan, do you think they'll go to jail? I didn't say a single word. I stood there in my black coat, my hands folded in front of me, and let the cameras flash. Silence is louder than anything else when the world expects you to scream. I walked past them calm measured. That's what scared Vivian the most when she saw me outside their house the day the investigation notice was delivered. She was standing on the porch, wrapped in a robe, her hair messy for the first time in years. She shouted something at me. Accusations, insults, half-broken pleas. I couldn't even hear the words over the sound of her fear. She'd built an empire of appearances, and I'd torn it apart by showing them what was real. Arthur stayed inside. He didn't come out. Maybe he knew there was nothing left to say. Maybe shame finally found its way through the thick walls he built around himself. The days bled together into hearings and statements and quiet collapses. The people who once filled their house with laughter stopped returning their calls. Invitations vanished, accounts froze. Lawyers became their only company. Vivian tried to fight it at first, hired PR teams to clean up the narrative, but there's no way to clean up what people saw with their own eyes. That image of her locking the door became the headline photo of every article. Her name trended for all the wrong reasons. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about letting the truth live where everyone could see it. I watched from the background as everything they valued crumbled. Every fundraiser, every polished interview, every handshake had been a performance. I had ripped the curtain down. One evening, as the snow fell, just like it had a year earlier, I walked past their house. It was dark except for a single lamp in the window. No guests, no warmth, no Vivian. The Blake house looked exactly like it did the night they left me outside. Except now, they were the ones trapped in the silence. A neighbor crossed the street and nodded at me, not out of pity, but out of understanding. It was the first time I realized the story wasn't just mine anymore. Everyone who had looked away that night now looked directly at them. People whispered my name with a kind of respect that I never wanted, but somehow earned. Aiden told me one day in his office, "They're done. You don't have to say a thing." And I didn't. I watched the legal system work like slow grinding gears, pulling them through every inch of accountability. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was enough to make them bleed where it hurt them most: power, reputation, control. When the court ordered the partial freezing of their assets, Vivian lost the last shred of her control. She showed up at the courthouse looking nothing like the woman who once ran charity galas. Her nails, chipped makeup, smeared eyes wide with the panic of someone who realized no one was coming to save her. She glared at me from across the hallway like she was still trying to find a way to make me the villain in her story. But villains don't stand still. Victims don't either. I gave her nothing to feed on. I just stared back. Arthur eventually stepped down from every board seat he held. The man who once walked into meetings with the weight of the Blake name behind him was now just a man. No power, no reputation. Just a father who locked his pregnant daughter outside in the snow. The newspaper stopped calling him Arthur Blake, CEO of Blake Timber, and started calling him Arthur Blake, defendant. The night the verdict for the asset freeze went public, I walked down the empty street outside my apartment. The air was cold, but this time it didn't sting. It felt clean. The snow under my boots crunched softly. For the first time in a year, I didn't feel like I was standing outside someone else's house. I felt like I was standing on solid ground. People asked me later why I never spoke to the media. The answer was simple. They had taken everything from me that night: the baby, the warmth, the illusion of family. Speaking would have been giving them a stage. Silence was my weapon. My stillness forced them to hear the echo of their own actions, and that echo followed them everywhere they went. Revenge wasn't the moment the footage played on the screen. It wasn't even the moment their world cracked. It was this: the aftermath, the quiet unraveling of their names, their faces, their empire. Watching them drown in the silence they gave me. That was the price they paid, and I made sure it was one they could never forget. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early March, a year and 2 months after the storm. Burlington was thawing out. The snowbanks were receding, leaving behind wet pavement and pale light reflecting off the brick buildings downtown. I had learned to like the silence of this apartment. It was small but clean, with windows that overlooked the lake. I kept everything simple. Aiden said it looked more like a fortress than a home, and he wasn't wrong. I didn't buy soft rugs or paintings. I didn't need things that pretended to be warm. I was making tea when the knock came. Not loud, not timid, familiar. My stomach tightened before I even moved toward the door. I already knew who it was. Some people carry their presence like a scent you can never scrub away. I looked through the peephole, and there he was. Arthur Blake, my father. Or what was left of him. He wasn't the man who used to stand at charity galas, shaking hands and smiling for cameras. He wasn't the man who locked the door while I begged on the porch. He was just a figure hunched in a heavy coat, eyes sunk deep into his face, looking older than the Vermont winter itself. I opened the door, but only halfway. He looked up, startled, like he hadn't expected me to give him even that. His voice cracked before he said anything. "Rowan." I didn't answer. I let the silence stretch, the same silence he had given me that night. He fumbled with his gloves before shoving them into his pocket, a man who didn't know where to put his hands when his power was gone. "Can I come in?" His voice was small. I stepped aside just enough for him to cross the threshold, not because he deserved it, but because I wanted him to see what it felt like to stand inside a place he had no power over. He walked into the living room, eyes moving across the bare walls, the neat order of everything. I didn't offer him a seat. He sat anyway, lowering himself slowly into the chair across from me, like a man entering a courtroom he already knew he'd lose. When he finally spoke, the words dragged out of him like stones. "I've lost everything." His hands were shaking. Not with cold, with the weight of everything he'd built collapsing. The company, the house, the reputation. Vivian, all of it. I stood near the window, not facing him, just watching the light change over the water. I waited. He filled the silence because he had always needed sound to survive. I thought I was doing the right thing, Rowan. I thought if I kept the peace. He trailed off because even he didn't believe his own excuses. The words sounded pathetic hanging in the air. "You didn't keep the peace," I said finally. "You kept the lock on the door." He flinched like I'd hit him. I turned then, meeting his eyes. The man sitting in front of me wasn't the father I had spent years begging for love from. That man had died the night he stood behind Vivian and said nothing. This was just what remained. I told myself I wouldn't feel anything if I saw him like this, but feelings have a way of slithering through cracks you didn't know were open. I didn't feel pity, but I did feel the cold satisfaction of balance, returning to a world that had once left me freezing outside. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. "I can't sleep. I can't walk through that house without hearing you, without seeing you out there. Every time it snows, I see you. I close my eyes and I see your hands on that door. I see—" He broke off. His voice caught on something sharp. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Let it sit. Let it choke him like the cold choked me. "I've lost everything," he repeated softer this time, like a prayer to a God that stopped listening long ago. He looked at me with eyes rimmed in red. "But you're still my daughter. I just want a chance to say I'm sorry. Sorry." That word has a strange weight when it arrives too late. It doesn't land like it should. It just hovers in the air like smoke from a fire long burned out. I walked closer until I stood just a few feet from him. I looked straight into his eyes, the same eyes that watched me through the curtain and didn't move. "You lost everything because you built your everything on silence," I said. "On pretending. On letting someone else decide who your daughter was." He tried to speak, but his throat closed around the words. The silence stretched again, only this time it was his silence, not mine. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A letter. "She wrote this," he said. "Vivian." I didn't reach for it. He unfolded it anyway, hands shaking, and read it out loud. "Rowan, I know I can never undo what happened. I know I've lost everything, but I need you to know I'm sorry. We're both sorry. We never meant for it to go this far. You were our family too. You're still our family." My jaw clenched at the last line. "You were our family." Past tense. He lowered the letter slowly. "She's sick, Rowan. The doctors say she's not doing well. She wants to see you. Just once." He waited for something to soften in my face. It didn't. I don't know if you've ever watched someone realize that there's no forgiveness left in the room. It's not dramatic. It's quiet. His eyes dropped to the floor. His shoulders sagged. I saw the exact moment he understood that the door he had closed that night wasn't just the one to the house. It was the one to me. I stepped forward, close enough for him to see my breath in the cold air seeping in from the window. "I lost something too," I said. "Something you'll never understand. And you can't give it back. Not with apologies. Not with letters. Not with anything." His face crumpled. It wasn't theatrical. It was small, quiet, almost pitiful. "Rowan, please." I could hear the wet sound of his breath catching. "I'm begging you." I let him speak those words because I remembered screaming my own against a locked door. Then I gave him nothing. I walked to the door and opened it. The winter wind rushed in sharp and clean. He stared at me like he didn't understand at first, like the man who locked me out couldn't comprehend being on the other side. "You should go," I said. His eyes filled with tears, the kind of tears that mean nothing when they come too late. He stood slowly, each movement heavy, and walked toward the doorway. When he reached me, he stopped. He searched my face for something mercy, maybe. The daughter he used to know. I wasn't there. That girl had frozen to death on the porch a long time ago. He stepped outside. I didn't slam the door. I closed it slowly, deliberately, until it clicked. That soft click sounded exactly like the one I'd heard a year ago, only this time I was the one on the warm side. This time I was the one choosing. I stood there with my hand on the knob, listening. No footsteps at first, just silence. Then the sound of him walking down the hallway, unsteady and broken. A week later, the letter from Vivian arrived at my door. She didn't come herself. She didn't have the courage for that. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. She wrote about hospitals, about sleepless nights, about wanting to see me before it was too late. She begged for forgiveness. She tried to sound like a mother. I didn't respond. I folded the letter carefully and slid it into a drawer I never opened again. I could have gone to see her. I could have listened to her excuses, watched her cry. But forgiveness isn't a currency people like them get to spend after they've taken everything. The porch that night was a door they locked themselves. I wasn't going to open it for them. Arthur came one last time that spring. He stood outside my door again, but he didn't knock. I watched him through the peephole. He stood there for a long time, hands deep in his pockets, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. Then he turned and left without a sound. Some people think revenge ends with fireworks, with shouting, with one final blow. They're wrong. Sometimes it ends like this. A man walking away from a door he'll never be allowed to enter again. A woman standing inside, warm and still unshaken. I turned away from the door and let the silence settle back into my apartment. It was the same silence I had lived with since that night. Only now it belonged to me. It was mine, not theirs. And I wasn't cold anymore. The cabin was small, tucked between the quiet pines near Lake Champlain, where the air tasted like clean snow and wood smoke. I bought it in cash. No lawyers, no negotiations, no signatures tangled with anyone else's name. Just mine. It stood on the edge of the forest with a view of the frozen lake, a place where the world didn't echo their voices anymore. The day I moved in, the first snow of winter began to fall again. Not the kind that bites like knives, the soft kind, the kind that settles without a sound. The fire crackled in the stone hearth as I stacked logs and watched the orange glow pulse against the dark wood walls. I'd always hated winter after that night. The sound of the wind used to make my skin crawl. Now it was just wind, no longer a threat. Just a season passing through. I sat on the old rocking chair that came with the cabin, wrapped in a thick sweater, my hands warm around a mug of tea. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like a cage. It felt like mine. I started writing that winter. At first, just notes, little pieces of memory scattered across worn pages. But as the nights grew colder, the words grew heavier, sharper, more alive. I wrote about the porch, about the snow, about the sound of my heartbeat slowing as I lay there, about the night the doctor's voice broke the world in half. I wrote about the child who never had a chance to breathe the cold Vermont air, a child who was gone before they even had a name. There was no audience for the words, no headlines, no noise, just ink paper and the soft sound of fire. It didn't bring the baby back. It didn't fix anything. But it let me speak without anyone shutting a door in my face. The pages filled slowly. Line after line, the story that began with silence found its way out of me. A year earlier, I had been frozen to death on a porch that was never mine. Now I was here, in a home that was. Sometimes I still dreamed of the storm. I still woke up in the dark with snow in my lungs. But when I stepped outside the cabin, there was no door locked behind me. Just wind trees and the lake stretching out like an open hand. Healing doesn't come like a sudden sunrise. It comes in quiet moments when you realize you're not begging anymore. One morning, Aiden drove up in his old Jeep tires crunching against the packed snow. He stepped out wearing his usual scarf and that easy crooked grin he used when he wanted to keep things light. He brought pastries from a little cafe in town and 2 cups of hot chocolate. The steam curled in the cold air between us. I didn't say much. I didn't have to. He'd been there at every step of the storm's aftermath, steady when I couldn't be. He stood at the edge of the porch, looking out toward the lake, then turned to me. "You've built yourself a fortress," he said, half teasing, half proud. I shrugged, smiling for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "Not a fortress," I said. "A door I get to choose who walks through." He nodded slowly. The weight of everything that had happened sat between us, but it didn't press down like it used to. It just existed. A scar that didn't own me anymore. We sat on the porch steps eating pastries, watching the snow fall in slow, soft curtains. He told me about the cases he was working on, about the people who were still afraid to speak about the women who walked into his office whispering like they'd done something wrong when the world had wronged them. He said my story gave some of them courage. I didn't know what to say to that. I hadn't set out to be a symbol. I just wanted to survive. But sometimes survival is enough to light the way for someone else. The lake began to freeze over fully that week. At night, I could hear it shift and groan like it was breathing. It didn't scare me anymore. It was a sound of something vast and alive. I built shelves. I planted small pines around the edges of the property. I learned how to fix leaks and split wood. I didn't build a new life in a rush. I let it grow like the snow piling slowly on the branches outside. One night, I opened the notebook I'd filled over the winter and wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the last page. Justice isn't something you wait for. It's something you make. I closed it gently and set it on the table near the window where the moonlight pooled like silver. I'll never get back what I lost that night. There's no way to rewrite the sound of that door clicking shut. But I've learned something colder and sharper than revenge. I learned how to build a life on the other side of the storm. The snow kept falling. Aiden said he might visit more often. I didn't mind the thought. I didn't mind the quiet after he left either. Both belonged to me now. I walked outside that night barefoot for the first time since that night letting the snow bite gently at my skin. Not enough to hurt, just enough to remind me I was alive. I looked up at the black sky breathed in the cold and didn't flinch. For so long, that door had been their weapon. Now it was my shield, my choice, my home. And if anyone ever finds themselves standing in the snow with the door locked behind them, I want them to know this. If justice doesn't come, build it with your own hands. If they leave you outside, build your own door and never let them in again. The storm didn't break me. It forged me. And now, as the wind moved through the trees, soft and alive, I smiled into the night for the first time in years.